In June of 1944, thousands of Allied soldiers landed in Normandy to pave the way for the liberation of Europe. Among them were prisoners captured during the initial combats, young men who had survived the landing only to fall under the custody of the German forces. What was supposed to have been a prisoner of war treatment soon turned into a summary execution. SS units were ordered to eliminate the captives. There was no transfer to camps or records of prisoners. The soldiers were lined up in groups and shot within minutes. The action was not an isolated excess, but a deliberate crime committed under direct command. The result was the immediate elimination of dozens of combatants who had laid down their arms. Why were the D-Day prisoners executed without trial? What responsibility did the German officers have in the massacre? How did these crimes mark the memory of the Normandy campaign? The Day of Steel, Canadians break the wall at Juno. On the 6th of June 1944, the largest military operation executed in Western Europe throughout the entire war began on the French coast of Normandy. The day, known as D-Day, represented the opening of a decisive front against Germany. That morning, a vast Allied force was deployed over 5 beaches designated as Utor, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The responsibility for the Juno sector fell to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, advancing under the command of Major General Rod Keller, with the support of armoured units and the British fleet providing covering fire. The mission assigned to the Canadians consisted of securing the landing zone, linking up with the British forces attacking on both flanks and advancing inland to reach the Combayeux Road, a strategic point that could block any German counterattack towards the coast. Each brigade had precise objectives that included capturing coastal villages, road crossings, and neutralizing fortifications located on the coastal strip. The landing was scheduled for mid-morning, at a tide moment that would allow overcoming the defensive obstacles set by the Germans. The beach had been mined and reinforced following the plan of the Atlantic Wall. In front of it was deployed the 716th Infantry Regiment, composed mostly of static troops and lesser-trained recruits, but equipped with concrete pillboxes, coastal artillery pieces, and machine guns covering the main accesses. The weather conditions proved adverse. The strong winds and surf complicated the approach of the landing crafts. Several vessels sank or veered off course, which caused delays and disorganization in the first waves. Despite this, the 7th Canadian Brigade began the assault in front of Courseulles-sur-Mer and Grey-sur-Mer. The Royal Winnipeg Regiment and the Queen's Own Regiment of Canada landed under intense fire from MG-42 machine guns, anti-tank guns, and coastal artillery. The soldiers had to make their way through barbed wire and steel obstacles under sustained fire. Meanwhile, the 8th Brigade landed in front of Bernières-sur-Mer and Saint-Aubin. The North Shore Regiment of New Brunswick and the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada faced urban fortifications located near the shoreline. Combat engineers used explosive charges to open breaches in the walls and advance street by street. In Bernières, the infantry was contained until the Sherman tanks managed to land and provide direct fire support against the bunkers. Naval support played an essential role. British and Canadian destroyers approached the coast to use their artillery against enemy positions, destroying gun pieces that hindered the advance. Allied aviation also intervened, although with limited results due to bad weather and the scattering of bombs dropped before the landing. Once past the coastal strip, the 7th Brigade managed to secure Courseulles and penetrate towards the road crossings situated inland. The Queen's Own Rifles of Canada suffered significant losses in house-to-house combat, but managed to drive out the German garrison. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles continued the advance towards Grey, where they encountered more scattered resistance. For their part, the 8th Brigade secured Bernières after prolonged skirmishes and headed towards Beny-sur-Mer, where the 716th Regiment still maintained nests of resistance with snipers and machine guns that slowed the progression. The 9th Brigade landed in subsequent waves with the aim of reaching Carpiquet and the airfield near Caen. However, the advance was slower than planned. German counterattacks at scattered points forced the consolidation of intermediate positions and the postponement of the airfield's capture. Nevertheless, the Canadians managed to penetrate several kilometers inland, securing key locations, although without reaching all initial objectives. The losses were high. More than 1,000 men, including dead, wounded, and missing, were accounted for in the Juno sector. However, the Canadian advance was deeper than on other Allied beaches. In Omaha, for example, the United States forces barely managed to establish a beachhead. In contrast, the Canadian sector succeeded in linking up with the British in Gold and Sword, consolidating a continuous front line that ensured the stability of the operation as a whole. The 716th Regiment was practically destroyed after the day. Numerous soldiers died in combat or were captured. However, the German rear forces remained intact. The 21st Panzer Division was located south of Caen, and the 12th Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed of young members of the Hitler Youth, led by veterans from the Eastern Front, was ready to intervene. The German response was delayed by problems in the chain of command. The orders to mobilize the armored reserves did not arrive until later in the afternoon, because Hitler himself had not been informed in the early hours after the landing. This delay limited the German ability to launch an immediate counterattack and allowed the Canadians to strengthen their positions. During the course of the advance, groups of German soldiers began to be captured. Some surrendered immediately upon realizing that their positions had been overrun. Others offered isolated resistance before giving up. The number of captives grew rapidly, and the Canadian rear lacked prepared structures for their custody. The prisoners were gathered in improvised camps, waiting to be transferred to England. At the same time, some Canadians fell into enemy hands as a result of confused fighting in villages and fields where small groups were isolated. By the end of the 6th of June, the Canadian front had advanced several kilometers into occupied territory, but the line remained fragile. The commanders ordered consolidation of positions in anticipation of the imminent arrival of German reinforcements. The threat of the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend loomed to the south of Caen, anticipating even tougher confrontations in the following days. The day left behind an established beachhead, a significant number of casualties, and the certainty that the battle for Normandy was just beginning. Iron Youth, the Hitlerjugend division enters the scene. In the summer of 1943, after the defeats suffered on the Eastern Front, the German High Command pushed for the creation of new armored divisions. Among them emerged the 12th SS Panzer Division, known as Hitlerjugend. This unit distinguished itself from other Waffen-SS formations by its particular composition. Most of its members were young recruits from the Hitler Youth. The regime sought to turn the political indoctrination instilled from childhood into a disciplined and fanatical military force capable of fighting with determination against the growing power of the Allies. The organization process began in June of that year under the direct supervision of the SS and with the personal approval of Heinrich Himmler. Boys aged between 16 and 18 were recruited, transferred en masse to military training camps. Although their combat experience was non-existent, these young people had spent a good part of their childhood under intense ideological training and constant physical preparation. From the age of 10, they participated in marches, camps, and basic weapons training, which facilitated their transition to the regular army. To compensate for the recruits' inexperience, the division received a cadre of veteran officers and non-commissioned officers. Many came from the 1st SS Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and had fought on the Eastern Front. They brought knowledge in offensive and defensive operations and in methods of repression against the civilian population. The combination of indoctrinated youth and experienced leadership forged the character of the new division. The training took place between the summer of 1943 and the spring of 1944. The young people learned the use of light weapons, infantry tactics, hand-to-hand combat, and platoon discipline. They were also trained in the handling of armored vehicles and heavy weaponry, as the unit was conceived as a panzer division. The sessions included intensive physical training, military instruction, and constant political talks given by SS officers. The organizational structure included Panzer Grenadier regiments, an armored regiment, reconnaissance units, artillery, sappers, and logistical services. By the end of 1943, the division numbered around 20,000 men, with young people in the infantry regiments and veterans in the commands and technical specialties. Among the most influential leaders stood out Kurt Meyer, known as Panzer Meyer. Born in 1910 and a member of the SS since 1930, he had accumulated experience in rapid operations during the Ukraine campaign. His style was characterized by aggressiveness and a willingness to employ tough tactics against the enemy. Another key leader was Wilhelm Mohnke, a veteran of multiple campaigns from Poland and France to the Soviet Union. His reputation for absolute loyalty to the regime and his experience in repressive operations reinforced the division's ideological orientation. The staff included Hubert Meyer, while the first appointed commander was Fritz Witt, a veteran of campaigns in France, Greece, and the Soviet Union, recognized for his organizational skills. The experiences accumulated by these officers in Belarus and Ukraine proved decisive. There, they had participated in repression operations that included the destruction of villages, shootings of civilians, and fighting against partisans. That heritage marked the operational culture of the division, where the distinction between military and repressive actions was blurred. Political indoctrination remained constant. The young men received daily lessons on the mission of National Socialism, the fight against Bolshevism, and unconditional obedience to superiors. Racism was a central part of that training, conveying contempt towards captured enemies and promoting the idea that they were unworthy of consideration. In the spring of 1944, the division reached its full operational capability. It was deployed in Normandy as part of Army Group B, under the command of Erwin Rommel. Its location in the Caen region was based on a strategic criterion. It was to act as an immediate counterattack force against any Allied landing attempts. On the 6th of June, when the invasion began, the division was still completing training and adjustments to its equipment. Although it was considered ready for combat, it had not yet participated in direct engagements. The decision to mobilize it depended on authorization from the High Command in Berlin, which delayed its initial movements. During the first hours of the landing, the news reaching the headquarters was confused and fragmentary. The initial surprise and the lack of smooth communications prevented a coordinated response. It was not until the afternoon when the movements of units towards the front began. The Panzer Grenadier regiments were mobilized towards the Caen sector, where the Canadian and British forces had managed to establish a firm beachhead. In that context, the 25th Regiment, under the command of Kurt Meyer, set up its headquarters in the Abbey of Ardenne. From there, it would plan counterattacks against the Allied positions in localities like Putot-en-Bessin, Bretteville, and Auty. The mission of the division was clear: to halt the Canadian and British advance inland. The youth of its soldiers was not considered a disadvantage by the German command. On the contrary, it was interpreted as a guarantee of fanaticism and absolute resistance. With officers hardened by the Eastern Front and troops ready to obey without question, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend prepared to enter combat in Normandy. Its debut would mark one of the toughest episodes of the campaign. Putot on fire, prisoners ruthlessly gunned down. On June 7, 1944, just one day after the landing in Normandy, the Canadian front was in a fragile situation. The 3rd Division had managed to establish several inland positions, but still faced local counterattacks from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. One of the most contested places was Putot-en-Bessin, a small town located southwest of Courseulles. Its control was essential because it allowed dominance over access to the Caen-Bayeux Road, a key route for the movement of German reinforcements. During the morning, the Royal Winnipeg Regiment, part of the Canadian 7th Brigade, managed to occupy the village after intense fighting. The soldiers advanced through narrow streets, neutralizing German defenses and taking prisoners. They established defensive positions in houses and gardens, aware of the importance of holding the location. However, the initial success quickly crumbled. By midday, the 12th SS launched a counterattack with mechanized infantry and Panzer IV model tanks. The German force penetrated the village with great violence and forced the Canadians to retreat. The fight lasted several hours and ended with Putot again under German control. During the retreat, numerous Canadians were isolated. Some resisted in buildings until they ran out of ammunition, while others attempted to flee toward their own lines and were captured in surrounding fields and roads. It is estimated that in the course of that day, more than 100 Canadian soldiers were taken prisoner in Putot and its surroundings. It was in that context that the first documented executions of Allied prisoners took place in Normandy. The testimonies collected after the war, both from local peasants and survivors, describe murders committed immediately after capture. On a nearby road, a group of Canadians surrendered with their arms raised. They were lined up along the roadside, and shortly after, soldiers of the 12th SS fired with automatic weapons, killing most on the spot. Some tried to flee but were shot down a few meters away. The bodies lay along the road, visible to the villagers who were later forced to remove them. Other prisoners were executed individually. A Canadian who refused to abandon an injured comrade was overpowered by a German soldier who pinned him to the ground and repeatedly stabbed him with the bayonet. The injured one, unable to move, was finished off shortly after with a shot at close range. There were also cases of physical violence prior to execution, blows with rifle butts that fractured bones, followed by shots to the head. A witness reported that a Canadian was knocked down, beaten until unconscious, and subsequently executed with several shots to the head. The inhabitants of Putot-en-Bessin observed these scenes from a certain distance. After the combat, members of the 12th SS forced peasants to bury bodies in improvised graves by roadsides or in nearby ditches. The villagers remembered that several corpses had stab wounds in addition to bullet impacts, which later confirmed the brutality of the deaths. The shallow graves facilitated the recovery of the bodies when the Canadians returned days later. The violence was not identical in all cases. Some testimonies indicate that a senior-ranking German officer intervened to prevent the execution of a group of prisoners and ordered their transfer to the rear. However, that decision had limited reach as other detachments of the same division continued killing captives in neighboring sectors. The lack of internal coordination and the attitude of certain subordinate commands favored the repetition of executions in different places around the village. For the surviving Canadians, the surrender in Putot offered no guarantee. Some managed to escape and later recounted that they saw how their comrades were shot down after surrendering their weapons. In certain cases, the prisoners were searched for documents or maps and executed immediately afterward. These practices were repeated in several nearby locations during the 7th and 8th of June. The exact number of victims in Putot could not be established precisely, but later Canadian reports agreed that several dozen prisoners were killed after their capture. Others were taken to the Abbey of Ardenne, where they would face a different fate in the following days. What happened in Putot stands out for the immediate nature of the crimes. The executions were carried out on the same battlefield, minutes after surrender, without transfer to detention centers. Subsequent investigations confirmed these facts through testimonies of villagers, statements of escaped Canadian soldiers, and forensic analysis of the recovered bodies. The autopsies revealed multiple bayonet wounds, fractures from blows, and close-range gunshots, which matched the accounts of those who had witnessed the violence. On the 8th of June, the 7th Brigade, reinforced with armored vehicles, launched a counterattack to recover Putot. After intense fighting, the town returned to Canadian hands. In the streets and nearby fields, they found the bodies of their comrades. Many had gunshot wounds to the head, others had stab wounds to the abdomen or torso. Military reports described groups of prisoners executed after surrender, confirming what the villagers had observed and what the survivors had recounted. The order from the Germans to the peasants to hide the bodies in improvised graves did not prevent the evidence from being uncovered. The speed of the Allied counter-offensive allowed the burial sites to be located and the remains recovered. The crimes committed in Putot established a pattern that would be repeated in Normandy during the following weeks. Captures followed by quick searches and immediate executions in open violation of international conventions. The shadow of Ardenne, the barracks turned into a slaughterhouse. The Abbey of Ardenne stood on the outskirts of Caen, surrounded by stone walls and inner gardens. This medieval monastic complex had been requisitioned by German forces before the invasion and used as a concentration point for troops and material. After the Allied landing, the place acquired a new role. It became the headquarters of Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division. The choice was due to two factors. On one hand, the proximity to the access routes to Caen, a strategic area for any German counteroffensive. On the other, the solidity of the structures, which offered relative protection against artillery bombardments and air attacks. On the 7th of June 1944, the first Canadian prisoners began to arrive at the compound. The 3rd Division had fought in Putot-en-Bessin, Auty, and Buron, and in those engagements some of its men were captured. Once inside the abbey, the prisoners were led to the central courtyard. There they were searched by members of the 12th SS for handguns, operation documents, and position maps. Personal belongings such as badges, watches, or letters were also taken from them. The next step was a brief interrogation. They were asked about their unit, the number of troops deployed, and the location of armored vehicles and artillery pieces. There is no evidence that systematic torture was applied at this stage, although several subsequent testimonies agree that there were beatings and threats. The procedure varied depending on the officer on duty. Some prisoners were held in makeshift quarters, others were taken to the back garden. In the latter case, the consequence was immediate. The garden, surrounded by high walls and partially covered by vegetation, offered privacy and isolation. Prisoners entered one by one or in small groups. They were made to stand without hoods or blindfolds. A soldier armed with a pistol or submachine gun was positioned behind or beside them and shot at close range, usually to the head or neck. The bodies lay on the ground and were sometimes dragged to less visible corners. Between the 7th and the 8th of June, at least 18 Canadian soldiers were executed. The identities were known later thanks to lists of missing persons and the tags found on the bodies. Among the victims were men from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. Some had been captured in Authie and Buron, others transferred from Putot. None survived after entering the Abbey's garden. There were isolated exceptions. A Canadian soldier managed to escape by jumping over a hedge and hiding in the nearby fields until reaching his lines. His account proved crucial as he described in detail how prisoners were searched, interrogated, and then led to the garden for their elimination. Other testimonies came from local farmers. From a distance, they heard gunshots and saw unusual movements inside. These observations coincided with the investigations carried out after the liberation of Caen. When the city was taken in July, the Canadian troops returned to the Abbey. In the garden, they found human remains buried in shallow graves. The bodies still had uniforms and identification tags, which allowed their recognition. Medical reports indicated gunshot wounds to the head, ruling out any possibility that they had died in combat. The garden walls showed projectile impacts concentrated in areas matching the position of the bodies. The layout of the place helped to understand the mechanics. The central courtyard served as a gathering space for prisoners. From there, they were led through a narrow corridor to the backyard. The high walls prevented seeing what happened inside and partially muffled the sound of the shots, explaining the scant perception from the neighboring villages. The repetition of the procedure in several groups shows that it was not an isolated action, but a deliberate practice. The Allied records confirmed 18 executions, although some testimonies indicated that there could have been more. The recovered bodies included junior officers, rank-and-file soldiers, and technical specialists, all belonging to units that had fought on the front line after the landing at Juno. The episode of the Abbey of Ardenne became one of the most well-known crimes of the Normandy campaign, not only because of the brutality of the deaths, but also because it was committed in a place that officially functioned as a regimental headquarters. The involvement of the commanders was established in subsequent judicial investigations. The testimony of the soldier who escaped, along with forensic evidence and military reports, was key in the proceedings against Kurt Meyer and other officers of the division. The monastic complex was thus marked as a symbol of how the 12th SS combined military operations and summary executions in the early days of June. Executed in silence, massacres in Norman castles and paths. The battles that followed the landing in Normandy transformed the nature of violence against Canadian prisoners. After the clashes at Putot-en-Bessin and the Abbey of Ardenne, the 8th and 9th of June 1944 marked an escalation in repression. What had previously been immediate executions after capture became systematic, planned and repeated massacres in different locations under the control of the 12th SS Hitler Youth Division. The scenes of these actions were concentrated around Bretteville, Putot, Caen and Quesnay. In Bretteville, the 7th Canadian Brigade had secured defensive positions, but the German counterattacks did not cease. During those confusing hours, several soldiers were surrounded and captured. Instead of being sent to the rear, around 20 were taken to the outskirts of the town. There they were lined up next to a ditch and shot by a platoon. The villagers, later forced to remove the bodies, recalled how they were dragged to nearby fields and buried in a shallow manner. An episode of great impact occurred in a chateau requisitioned as a headquarters by a battalion of the division. At noon on the 8th of June, 24 Canadians and 2 Britons were led into the building. After a quick search and brief interrogations, they were ordered to march to a nearby shooting range. There, the 26 prisoners were forced to line up with their hands up or behind their heads. In front of them, a platoon of Panzer Grenadiers awaited the order. Upon receiving it, the SS opened fire with rifles and machine guns. Most fell instantly. Those still moving were finished off with shots at close range. Among the victims was a Canadian doctor clearly identified with a Red Cross armband. His execution, despite the international protection that covered him, demonstrated that the elimination of prisoners was a conscious decision. Subsequent investigations confirmed that it was a planned collective execution. The recovered bodies showed impacts from the front and back, with grouping of corpses in a small area. The finding of the intact medical uniform reinforced the evidence that there was no error in identification. The roads that linked Caen with Quesnay were also scenes of massacres. Several groups of prisoners captured during counterattacks were forced to march to remote areas. On a stretch south of Caen, approximately 17 Canadians were lined up in the ditch and executed with bursts of machine gun fire. The peasants who later had to remove the bodies reported that the victims had gunshot wounds concentrated on the back of the neck, indicating that they were forced to kneel or bend over before being shot. In Quesnay, another group of between 30 and 40 soldiers was taken to a clearing beside the road. After forcing them to raise their hands, a German officer informed them that they would not be sent to a prisoner camp. Then the order to open fire was given. Most died on the spot, but some tried to flee. 5 men initially managed to escape, though 4 were shot down during the chase. Only 1 managed to reach the Canadian lines and bear witness to what happened. When the area was liberated, graves with remains were found with multiple impacts and, in some cases, hands tied with straps. The accounts of those who survived coincided in the mechanics. A soldier recounted that when the shooting started, he dropped to the ground pretending to be dead and managed to escape during the night. Others narrated that they remained motionless under the bodies of their comrades until the SS withdrew. These coincidences show a clear pattern: aligned groups, machine gun fire, and sometimes individual shots at close range. Allied reports corroborated these accounts with autopsies. The bodies showed gunshots concentrated in the head and torso, as well as bindings on hands and wrists in some cases. Medical results confirmed that they were not deaths in combat, but rather summary executions. The testimonies of civilians and escaped soldiers agreed on one essential point. From the 8th of June, violence against Canadian prisoners became a common practice in the 12th SS sector. The sequence was always the same: capture, quick search, brief interrogation, and group execution. The locations varied between ditches, open fields, or gardens of requisitioned buildings, but the mechanics were repeated in an identical manner. The magnitude of these massacres was reflected in the figures estimated by Allied reports. Between the 7th and the 10th of June, in the vicinity of Putot, Bretteville, and Quesnay, it is estimated that between 80 and 100 prisoners were executed. Most were Canadians, although there were also British. The records of the missing compared with the exhumed bodies showed that numerous men who had been reported as prisoners of war never reached camps in the rear, which confirms that they were eliminated during those days. Some managed to escape and recount what happened. Their testimonies were decisive in reconstructing the massacres and clearly established the repetitive mechanics. They described rows of 10, 20, or 40 men lined up in clearings or ditches, shootings with machine guns and finishing shots. The orders were given by officers or non-commissioned officers present, without apparent improvisation. The repetition of these acts in different places over a brief period indicates that the practice was tolerated, if not directly ordered, by the division's commanders. The command structure of the 12th SS granted some autonomy to company and battalion leaders, which explains differences in the number of victims and in the location of the massacres. However, the similarity in the methods points to a common guideline: avoid the transfer of large groups of prisoners and eliminate them at the same place of capture. The procedure had been systematized in a few days, becoming part of the division's modus operandi. The massacres of those days were distinguished from the immediate executions in Putot by their scale and organization. While in Putot, the violence arose amidst urban combat in the chateau, roads, and open fields, the executions followed more elaborate protocols, with planned transfers and organized collective elimination. That evolution marked a turning point in the conduct of the division, which from then on would consolidate a pattern of systematic repression throughout the Canadian sector. Hidden hunt, erased prisoners in fields and forests. After the massacres that occurred in Putot-en-Bessin, Bretteville, Quesnay, and the Abbey of Ardenne, the violence against Canadian prisoners did not cease. The days following the initial battles showed a different phenomenon: scattered executions, carried out in small rural localities with a small number of victims and in improvised settings. These deaths did not reach the magnitude of the collective massacres, but they followed a recognizable pattern. Soldiers captured in groups of 3, 5, or 10 men were taken away from the front and eliminated without leaving an official trace. The main characteristic of these episodes was the geographical dispersion and the difficulty in documenting them accurately, which explains why in many cases the exact number of victims was never established. In various Norman villages, executions were recorded in stables and barns requisitioned as command posts or rest areas for German troops. The prisoners were detained for a few hours, guarded by a small number of soldiers, and then led out of the buildings to nearby woods or open fields. There they were shot with pistols or light machine guns. Sometimes the bodies were left abandoned in the same place. At other times they were buried under the floors of the barns or in adjacent ditches. The farmers of the region, forced to collaborate under threat, recalled that many times they had to cover the bodies with earth in improvised graves. The craters left by Allied air raids and artillery also became execution sites. The presence of depressions in farmland offered German units quick graves. Testimonies collected after the war indicated that small groups of prisoners, of 3 to 5 men, were taken to the edge of these craters and executed with shots to the head. The bodies were pushed inside and covered with soil superficially. In several cases, the remains were discovered weeks later, when the peasants returned to work their lands after the German retreat. Some accounts came from Polish conscripts forcibly enlisted into the Wehrmacht and assigned as auxiliaries in German units. In later statements, they described the shootings of Canadian prisoners under the supervision of SS officers. One reported having seen 7 men lined up in front of a light machine gun and shot down in seconds. Another claimed that after the execution, the bodies were covered with branches and soil in a forest without a formal burial. These statements showed the involvement of auxiliary troops in surveillance tasks and their direct exposure to the violence exerted by the division. German prisoners captured by the Allies confirmed the existence of these practices. Wehrmacht soldiers assigned as rear personnel or support acknowledged that the executions of Allied prisoners were known within the troops. Some claimed to have witnessed shootings, others said they had heard shots and received information from comrades. These statements provided an inside view of the dynamics of the 12th SS, where the elimination of prisoners had become normalized as a standard procedure. One of the main problems for researchers was the absence of bodies in several cases. Disappearances of between 15 and 20 Canadians were recorded whose fate could never be confirmed. Their names appeared on lists of the missing, but there were no records that they had reached prisoner camps in Germany or that they survived the war. Subsequent conclusions indicated that it was most likely they had been executed in remote locations and buried in graves that were never located. The dispersion of the fighting, the devastation caused by the artillery, and the constant changes in the front line complicated the recovery of remains. The civilian population played an important role as an indirect witness. In several villages, peasants and neighbors saw how small groups of prisoners were taken to stables, forests, or fields, and shortly after they heard gunshots. However, the fear of reprisals from the SS forced them to remain silent. In some cases, entire families hid what they saw until after the liberation, when they could recount it to the Allied authorities. A farmer from the outskirts of Hidden Hunt erased prisoners in fields and forests. After the massacres that occurred in Putot-en-Bessin, Bretteville, Quesnay, and the Abbey of Ardenne, the violence against Canadian prisoners did not cease. The days following the initial battles showed a different phenomenon: scattered executions, carried out in small rural localities with a small number of victims and in improvised settings. These deaths did not reach the magnitude of the collective massacres, but they followed a recognizable pattern. Soldiers captured in groups of 3, 5, or 10 men were taken away from the front and eliminated without leaving an official trace. The main characteristic of these episodes was the geographical dispersion and the difficulty in documenting them accurately, which explains why in many cases the exact number of victims was never established. In various Norman villages, executions were recorded in stables and barns requisitioned as command posts or rest areas for German troops. The prisoners were detained for a few hours, guarded by a small number of soldiers, and then led out of the buildings to nearby woods or open fields. There they were shot with pistols or light machine guns. Sometimes the bodies were left abandoned in the same place. At other times, they were buried under the floors of the barns or in adjacent ditches. The farmers of the region, forced to collaborate under threat, recalled that many times they had to cover the bodies with earth in improvised graves. The craters left by Allied air raids and artillery also became execution sites. The presence of depressions in farmland offered German units quick graves. Testimonies collected after the war indicated that small groups of prisoners, of 3 to 5 men, were taken to the edge of these craters and executed with shots to the head. The bodies were pushed inside and covered with soil superficially. In several cases, the remains were discovered weeks later, when the peasants returned to work their lands after the German retreat. Some accounts came from Polish conscripts forcibly enlisted into the Wehrmacht and assigned as auxiliaries in German units. In later statements, they described the shootings of Canadian prisoners under the hidden hunt, erased prisoners in fields and forests. After the massacres that occurred in Putot-en-Bessin, Bretteville, Quesnay, and the Abbey of Ardenne, the violence against Canadian prisoners did not cease. The days following the initial battles showed a different phenomenon: scattered executions, carried out in small rural localities with a small number of victims and in improvised settings. These deaths did not reach the magnitude of the collective massacres, but they followed a recognizable pattern. Soldiers captured in groups. The Maya trial. Canada faces its blood-stained memory. The end of the Battle of Normandy did not close the issue of the execution of Canadian prisoners. From the first months after the landing, the Allied High Command and Canadian authorities promoted systematic investigations with the aim of documenting the facts, identifying those responsible, and preparing judicial processes. The most notable episode of these efforts was the arrest and trial of Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division. Meyer was captured by American troops in Belgium in September of 1944. After his detention, he was interrogated and handed over to the Canadian authorities, as most of the victims of his unit were soldiers from that country. The Canadian government decided to try him in a military court established in Aurich, Germany, in December of 1945. It was the first major war crimes trial held under Canadian jurisdiction. The charges against Meyer were based on the principle of command responsibility. Although it was not shown that he had personally participated in the executions, it was proven that he was in charge of a unit where systematic prisoner killings took place and that, as a commander, he had the obligation to prevent or punish them. The court accepted as evidence the testimonies of Canadian soldiers who survived the massacres, the statements of French civilians, and the documentation collected at the locations where the crimes occurred. A key testimony was that of a Canadian soldier who managed to escape from the Abbey of Ardenne. His detailed account of the interrogations and executions in the garden proved decisive. This testimony was supplemented by forensic reports on the bodies exhumed in Putot, Bretteville, and the Abbey itself, which confirmed deaths by close-range gunfire and ruled out any armed confrontation in those scenarios. On the 28th of December 1945, the court found Meyer guilty and sentenced him to death by firing squad. However, the sentence was commuted in January 1946 to life imprisonment by decision of General Harry Crerar, commander of the 1st Canadian Army. The commutation was based on the difficulty of proving that Meyer had given direct execution orders, although his responsibility for a mission of control over his subordinates was maintained. Meyer was transferred to Canada to serve his sentence at Dorchester Prison in the province of New Brunswick. He remained there until 1951, when he was transferred back to Germany to complete the sentence in a British military prison. Finally, in 1954, he was released after having served 9 years of imprisonment. His release provoked strong controversy in Canada, where many families of the victims considered that the time served did not correspond with the severity of the crimes. In addition to the trial against Meyer, other smaller trials were held against officers and non-commissioned officers of the 12th SS. Some middle-ranking officials were accused of participating in specific executions, But the majority of these processes faced great difficulties. The evidence was limited, orders were given verbally, and witnesses were scarce. As a consequence, only a small number of defendants received significant sentences, while many others went untried. One of the most discussed cases was that of Wilhelm Mohnke. As a battalion commander in the 12th SS during the Normandy campaign, he was indirectly implicated in several massacres. Captured by the Soviets, he spent several years in prison in the Soviet Union and was released in 1955. He returned to Germany and was never prosecuted for the crimes in Normandy. The absence of direct evidence linking him to specific execution orders prevented a formal trial. Until his death in the year 2001, Mohnke remained a controversial figure, held morally responsible but never judicially convicted. The memory of the victims remained deeply rooted in Canada. From the early post-war years, commemorative monuments were erected in Normandy. In Authie, plaques remember the soldiers killed in June of 1944. The Abbey of Ardenne became a place of permanent remembrance, with inscriptions and ceremonies in honor of the 18 soldiers executed in its garden. Canadian historiography dedicated numerous studies to these events. Books, articles, and documentaries analyzed the extent of the massacres and their impact on the morale of the troops. Maya's trial, in particular, was the subject of exhaustive examination from both the legal and military perspectives. The court records in Auric are preserved as an essential testimony to the efforts to establish responsibilities. In the audiovisual field, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation produced documentaries with testimonies from veterans and relatives of the victims, which helped consolidate the public memory of the crimes. On the international level, the episodes of Normandy were placed within the broader framework of Nazi war crimes. Although the scale was smaller than on the Eastern Front, its significance lay in the fact that they were committed against regular troops of an Allied army at an advanced stage of the war, when international norms regarding the treatment of prisoners were fully recognized. For Canada, they represented the greatest war crime suffered by its armed forces in its entire history. The Maya case became an example of the application of the principle of command responsibility. Just like in the Nuremberg trials, it was demonstrated that a commander could be convicted not only for directly ordering an execution, but also for allowing these practices to become habitual within his unit. This precedent influenced the subsequent development of international humanitarian law. As the decades passed, the commemoration of the victims was maintained. Every anniversary of the landing in Normandy, Canadian delegations travelled to France to pay tribute at the Abbey of Ardenne and other places where the executions took place. The ceremonies included the reading of the names of the killed soldiers and the participation of veterans when there were still some alive. Academic studies continued to expand the understanding of these events, linking them with the behaviour of the Waffen-SS in general and with the military culture of the Nazi regime. Historical analysis showed the relationship between the ideological indoctrination of the 12th SS, the prior experience of its commanders on the Eastern Front, and the adoption of repressive methods on the Western Front. This line of research allowed for a better understanding of the mechanisms that facilitated the commission of war crimes. The documentation generated by these investigations has also served as a basis for the development of legal studies on the protection of prisoners of war and on command responsibility. The cases of Normandy are frequently cited as examples in military manuals and in academic forums of international law. The memory of the Canadian soldiers executed in Normandy remains alive in the collective memory, both in Canada and France. The persistence of ceremonies, investigations, and publications reflects the importance of those episodes not only as part of the military history of the Second World War, but also as a central element in the construction of the Canadian memory of its participation in the conflict.